There's some comments on the third section of chapter 1. First thing I wanted to note is that maybe this visual helps. I like to draw the premises above the conclusion with an arrow from the premises to the conclusion like that. Sometimes I think that's helpful in seeing the idea of the flow and order of an argument. Okay, what are the basic ideas in chapter 1, section 3 here? We're continuing to figure out the conclusion of different arguments, and at this point the difference between an inductive argument and a deductive argument has been introduced. The idea is the different kind of arrow in effect as pictured right here. Induction is, we might think of it as a broken arrow. It's a probabilistic connection. If the premises are true, the conclusion is likely to be true. Deductive logic is where the conclusion is at least claimed to be necessarily following from the premises. In both cases, it needn't be there. The conclusion might not follow either with probability or with necessity. The analyzing of arguments to figure out how whether or not the alleged connection is actually there is the big thing that we ultimately build to. But at this point, we're just trying to figure out what's being claimed or asserted in terms of the connection between the premises and the conclusion. All right. We'll make a couple comments on that in reference to this second argument right here. I basically just pictured the premises here. I see dark clouds in the sky. The wind is really blowing, being given as premises or support for the claim that it's going to rain. Now, the nature of this points to induction. Hopefully, in an actual passage, we would have special words indicating that. Like we'd say that it's probably going to rain. It's likely going to rain. There's a good chance it's going to rain. Odds are it's going to rain. This is on page 8, words that indicate induction as opposed to deduction, and that's absolutely the most important thing that you need to keep in mind in reference to this section. It's when the author of a passage or speaker is telling us whether they're using inductive or deductive reasoning. If they don't tell us, well, we have to guess unless we're in a position where we can ask them. And that's where some of the other rules that are mentioned there will come into play. Most useful thing there is actually the fourth rule, besides for the first one with special indicator words, that is. Fourth rule says, hey, we got special kinds of induction and deduction. I got 5 types of each, which are not exhaustive, but definitely helpful in trying to differentiate between induction and deduction. And that will help you answer some questions when we come to the exam down the road. This particular one here is a prediction, and predictions are on the inductive side typically. I have an interesting contrast here though, where we do have a prediction, and for one of the special rules given there, really actually the 2 other rules that are not perfect guides but are definitely helpful, the third and the fourth rule on the list here. Let's see how they apply. This argument says, all right, let's go back and say that this argument is an induction. All right. Sorry about the delay there. Next argument says, whenever there are dark clouds in the sky, it's going to rain. There are indeed dark clouds in the sky, therefore it's going to rain. Now, the structure here is basically whenever a first thing happens and a second thing happens, and we have the first thing. So we reason to, and this is a core basic necessary reasoning process to the conclusion. So this one, again, let me sketch out the idea of the inference from the premises of the conclusion, is going to be a deduction. I chose these 2 examples to point out that it's not the nature of the conclusion, and it's not exactly the nature of the reasoning pattern, not only that determine induction as opposed to deduction. Here, since we have a necessary connection, absolutely whenever there's a necessary connection between the premises and the conclusion, the argument is deductive. Now, that is not to say that when the conclusion is necessarily true or clearly true or you believe it, of course the 2 conclusions and the 2 arguments sketched here are exactly the same. The difference is that the issue is in the first premise right here, which is that whenever there are dark clouds in the sky, it's going to rain. That claim's too strong, right? There are exceptions to that. We have a false premise here. The premise is the problem with this argument. We'll get to this as we go on down the road, but it is not in the reasoning pattern. The reasoning pattern just goes like this: when x, y, and then we have x, and then the conclusion is y. That's a good reasoning pattern. Classic deductive reasoning patterns, something very much like what's called modus ponens, as we'll see later in the course. So again, to recap, to determine between induction and deduction, the new topic for this section, look for words that indicate probability first and foremost, which tells you have an induction. Words that indicate necessary inference, or that the conclusion is necessarily true based on the premises, and that tells you deduction. If you don't have that, then you have to go to some trickier things. First and foremost, different types of induction and deduction as listed in the book. And secondly, that we covered, go over if there is in fact a necessary connection between the premise and the conclusion, you always say deduction. The other thing I didn't mention is if there are logical words, special kinds of logical words that partly you'll get a sense of as we go on through the course, but whenever there's a classic general logical inference word that suggests but by no means guarantees that we have a deduction.